going to start then with some of what economists call stylized facts. These are very convenient things for people who aren't really scientists, but have some pretensions of that direction. A stylized fact is a statement that isn't exactly true, but there's enough truth in it to be getting on with for the time being. And I'm going to talk about, give you some stylized facts about prosperity in the world today. I want to define rich countries as countries that have incomes per head more than half the level of the richest country in the world at the time. And I'm going to knock out, for these purposes, countries with a population under 2 million, because I want to be rid of. It's slightly dicey because you may have noticed just down the road the embassy in Spain of the United Arab Emirates, which is actually one of the countries I want to knock out of this for these purposes. I want to remove, as it were, Luxembourg and Monaco and Qatar and the UAE and talk about, as it were, countries that have significant populations and economies of the kind we recognize. So a rich country, in my terms, is a country that has an income per head of more than half the level of the richest country in the world. And under my definitions, the richest country in the world today would be Norway. And there are about 20 states that have incomes per head of more than half that level. This is the group of rich countries in the world today. And one of the interesting things which we'll develop, I think, in the course of what we have to talk about this morning, is that it's almost always the case that if a country joins that group of rich countries over the 200 years that economic growth has been widespread in the world, over these 2 centuries, once a country gets to the level of being a rich country, it stays there. The majority of rich countries in these terms are, of course, in Western Europe. There's 2 North American countries, Canada and the United States. There's Australia. There are 2 or 3, depending on whether you call Hong Kong a country or not. Singapore and Japan in Asia come into that group. And that's it. The 2 countries which don't fulfill the condition I fulfilled, they've been in that group and dropped out of it. Anyone have ideas about what they are? Country?
Argentina?
Argentina's one. Argentina was, some people claim it was the richest country in the world. It's nothing like that. But it was among that rich group in the late 19th century. And is not there anymore. There are 2 others, both of which have been, one of which has been relatively rich and is now teetering on the edge, the other of which comes in and out. One of them's in Europe and one's not. New Zealand is the conspicuous failure in this. Some of that's Britain's fault. We joined the EU and took away what was the dominant market for its agricultural products. They then compounded this external disaster with internal disasters, having first of all a kind of aggressively protectionist internal experiment, which didn't work, and then an aggressively deregulatory experiment, which also didn't work very well. And that took New Zealand pretty much out of that group of rich countries. And the other, of course, is Italy, which barely came in and barely stays out again. And then behind that, there's a group of countries that are kind of knocking on the door of the rich countries club. Spain is one. It's not there. It could be there. South Korea is another. Taiwan, again, if we call that a country, is one. 2 of the released countries of Eastern Europe, Poland and the Czech Republic. That's stylized facts about who's rich and who's poor. Now, my rich group are distinguished by a whole load of other characteristics, most of which are probably caused by high incomes rather than being the causes of high incomes. For example, population of rich countries is taller than the population of poor countries. That's probably caused by incomes via diet, although some of you will know there is evidence, for example, that CEOs are on average taller than the population as a whole. But I guess the causality in that runs one in that direction. So does the correlation from how rich a country is to indicators of quality of its environment in terms of water quality, air pollution in cities, and so on. But there are one or two things that are rather strong correlations, but don't seem to be caused by income per head in any sense. Any thoughts about what they are? Things that distinguish these rich countries, Western Europe, Canada and the United States, Australia.
Rule of law.
Sorry?
Rule of law.
The rule of law is certainly part of it, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment.
Democracies.
Sorry?
Democracies.
And democracy is also one. We're putting together a story that has this, a product of institutions, and that's something we'll develop. Think of something that has nothing to do with man-made institutions at all. Resources is interesting, but it's interesting for what it doesn't say, that these countries are not distinguished by having more resources rather than less. Norway, which I pointed out as the richest of these countries, is actually at the top because Norway has exceptional resources, and resources help one or two other countries like Canada and Australia in that group as well, but they're not primarily what's behind the wealth of Canada and Australia. And interestingly, Norway is the striking case of a country that has extraordinary resource wealth and actually manages to handle that resource wealth rather well. One can point to many poorer countries in the world where resources, actually many development economists talk about the resource curse, that actually having plentiful natural resources in many countries has tended to reduce standards of living rather than to increase them because it attracts. There's a combination.
Property rights.
Yeah, right, absolutely. What makes these countries rich is a combination of factors. But there's one oddity, actually, which I think was mentioned over here, which is climate. You know, one of the things about all these countries is that they're cold. And that goes through, you know, line by line. You know, if we look across Europe, it gets worse as you go south. Italy, I described as a country that was on the edge of my rich country group. Actually, if I were to split Italy into two and have a northern Italy and a southern Italy, there wouldn't be any argument about it. Northern Italy would be clearly among the rich countries, and southern Italy wouldn't be. The same might well be true in the United States. If the Confederacy had actually won, even after 150 years, it's still true, as Michael noted, that the Confederate states in the US are on average markedly poorer than the rest of the United States. And very likely that would have been greater had they been an independent country rather than one joined in the Union. And of course, Hong Kong and Singapore are exceptions to this, but they're exceptions to an awful lot of rules. They're rather peculiar states which have a combination of British institutions, going back to the institutional point, and a Chinese population. And of course, they only became rich after the widespread use of air conditioning. So we've identified a group of 20 countries that are actually at the frontier, what I think of as the technological frontier, who demonstrate what we are able to do with current technology. And by technology, I mean both physical technology and business methods and business processes. This is kind of the state of the art in terms of what we can achieve economically. And actually, if I look at these countries in terms of their productivity, which I'm going to measure by output per hour, they're bound much closer together than they are in the measure that I used to categorize them, which was GDP. Productivity, in that sense, across these group of 20 countries, is pretty much the same, reflecting this common access to business methods and technological capabilities. For example, and this is an example I use occasionally to drive people in the United States to apoplexy. If I look at productivity, then there's almost no difference between France and the United States. Although consumption per head is between 50 and 60% higher in the United States than it is in France. How do I reconcile these things? 5 or 6 weeks holiday and lunch is a large part of the explanation of the difference. Working hours are very considerably longer. They're very considerably longer generally in the US than they are across most of Europe, in fact. And they're certainly much longer in the United States than they are in France, or for that matter, Germany. So working hours are longer. Working lives are also considerably shorter. If I compare the United States and France and take men between 25 and 60, the proportions of them who are working are almost the same in the two countries. If I look at women instead, there isn't that much difference. France and other Southern European countries used to have smaller proportions of the female population in employment, but that's been changing quite markedly. Where there is a big difference is in the proportion of the population under 25 who are working and the proportion of the population over 60 who are working. In fact, if I stick with that comparison of France and the United States, the proportion of men over 60 who are working in France is the same as the proportion of men over 70 who are working in the United States. It's as unusual for a Frenchman to be working in his 60s as it is for an American to be working in his 70s, which is actually pretty unusual. A few years ago, when I first looked at some of these statistics, I would joke that the only Frenchman over 65 who's still working was President Chirac. And the only reason he was still working was to stay out of jail. But that's good style. So the second part of the explanation is actually shorter working lives. And the third part of the explanation is there is much more expenditure on public infrastructure in France than there is in the United States, which is the main driver, along with much more generous welfare benefits. I should add that the low retirement age of France isn't just a matter of the French public sector, although the French public sector is an extreme demonstration of it. It's true in the private sector in France as well. So France is different because they spend more on infrastructure, they have more holidays, they go home for lunch in most of the country, and they retire early, and the brighter of young French people spend an awful lot of time messing around in terrible French universities before they actually settle down and get a proper job. It's not entirely clear, taking it all together, that the French have got it wrong. And, this is one of these comparisons. in which the population of both countries would probably prefer to be in the country which they are in. Although, taken as a whole, there seem to be more in fact, as a statistical fact, there are relatively more Americans who take up residence in France than there are French people who take up residence in the United States. So, in this sense, all these 20 countries are much the same in terms of their economic capabilities. A lot of the differences we observe are, as in my French-American comparison, and the French-American comparison is a rather extreme illustration of it. They're in the ways in which these countries choose to exploit the opportunities which are given to them by state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art business processes. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you saw yesterday Beverly's rather moving video of the village which she and her colleagues in William Hill are helping with in Kenya. And you must have asked yourself the question, given all that we do know about technology, given all that we do know about how to run business, why is it that these people in Kenya are still living in an environment which is like that and which is less developed than we in Europe enjoyed more than 200 years ago? Why is it? Why are these countries poor? And why is it that they seem, as it were, mired in the situation which they're now in? Corruption is clearly part of the story. Michael and George mentioned earlier property rights, rule of law. None of these things are very well established in Kenya. More? Climate seems to go the other way. We haven't quite got on top of why it is that cold countries are poor, cold countries are rich, and hot countries are poor. Although we can speculate on some of the explanations. I had an interesting flash on that a few months ago when I was in Iceland, and I happened to mention, this is the kind of thing I'm afraid boring people like me do, that Iceland had the longest life expectancy of any country in the world. And someone asked, isn't that rather odd, since Iceland is, at least in climatic terms, a pretty inhospitable place? Now, why do Icelanders live so long? And the flip answer I proffered to that, but I think it's probably the right answer, is if you have genetic selection going on in an extremely hostile environment, and then you give that environment central heating and access to world-class medical treatment, you have a population which lives a long time. And that probably goes to other aspects of development as well, that rich Scandinavian countries, which have been, in many ways, the economic success stories of the last century, having moved from once being extremely poor countries to now being extremely rich countries. That all these countries' environments where the hostility of the environment led people to work hard and to work cooperatively. And these proved to be virtues, great virtues in environments which no longer are hostile in the way they once were as a result of the advances in technology, which make a different kind of style of life possible. So maybe that's a kind of benefit which, an odd sort of benefit which we have in cooler climates that the Kenyans don't have. It's easy to understand why Norwegians don't spend loads of time in the way Greeks or Spaniards do, of men sitting round in small villages drinking ouzo or wine. It's not a lot of fun to do that in a cafe in Trondheim. So climate may well be part of it. Resources, importantly, I think we've cut out. We haven't talked much about physical infrastructure either, the kind of roads and railways that are needed to make a modern economy possible, reliable electricity and telecoms. I think it was, who was it yesterday? It was right at the beginning. It was George who talked about the way in which mobile communications had made a large difference in Africa by starting to create a reliable infrastructure, not just for communication, but also for making payments, which is something that has happened in Kenya in a very striking way, that the mobile phone system has become, for much of Kenya, the principal payment mechanism as well. What we learn going through these things is that it's all of these things, and it's all of these things taken together. All of them, the social institutions of property, rule of law, etc. It's the physical attributes of infrastructure and the like, the corruption and the idea of government working for the whole that overlays it. The simple idea that the most effective way of making money in business is actually to produce goods and services that other people want, rather than to get contracts for your business by the use of political connections. We should come back to that point, because we may not be very good at maintaining that in our own democracy.
Diamond, guns, germs, and steel,
Yeah.
but also climate meant that animals moved on the same level, and that horses, etc., the transport animals, never crossed the equator. So there's all kinds of stuff about how climate affected pre-industrialization. Because only with industrialization and with controlling temperature did the North really take off, because before that, riches were in the Mediterranean basin.
Yes, I don't know how many of you know Jared Diamond's book, which is called Guns, Germs and Steel, and I think its subtitle is An Economic History of the Last 13,000 Years. And that describes exactly what it does in an extraordinarily interesting way. And it relates very much to this: why are all these rich countries in a temperate zone? They are actually across a belt, essentially in Eurasia, with the addition of areas outside Eurasia that were settled by people who had gone from Eurasia. And that, that settlement issue is a reminder again to us of the importance of institutions in making some countries rich and some countries poor. And it's striking, if one looks at colonial legacies, that where colonization was accompanied by settlement, bluntly in the countries like Australia, Canada, and the United States, where the immigrants wiped out the indigenous populations and settled it themselves, they established rich countries. In the cases where they simply colonized, that is, they dominated the existing population and then withdrew, they actually didn't leave rich countries, except in these two oddball and significant cases of Hong Kong and Singapore. So we've talked about what the rich countries of the world are. We've talked about some things that differentiate rich and poor. We can now see that there's a group of countries at the technological frontier, and there's a group of countries which are way inside it. Go back to looking at Kenya, and we know that in Kenya, they are just so far within the limits of what we know is technologically and institutionally possible. That also means that once you start putting together these sets of institutions and physical infrastructure, if you're inside that frontier, you can grow very rapidly as you move towards it. And that's been really the history of catch-up of many countries since the Industrial Revolution first happened on a kind of axis from Manchester to Frankfurt at the end of the 18th century. It happened in a group of countries there at that time. Other countries were much slower to link on to that particular train. But when they did, they could enjoy periods of relatively rapid growth as they moved towards that kind of technological frontier. And as the technological frontier has got further and further ahead in our countries, as it has, there's been more and more opportunity for countries that have finally got it together in this institutional infrastructure sense to grow rapidly. And of course, the first country to grow really rapidly on that basis was Japan after the Second World War. That was really the first case of countries chalking up 8-10% annual growth rates as Japan moved towards that technological frontier. That's something that has since been repeated in Korea, and it's the phenomenon which we're now seeing in China. And indeed, in these countries, one asks the question, really, why did this not happen earlier? There's a Yale historian called Ken Pomerantz who has written a book called The Great Divergence, which is about what is, for many people, one of the great puzzles of economic history, which is really why did the Industrial Revolution happen in the 18th century in Western Europe rather than in Southeast China? And so many of the factors which people have talked about as lying behind that Industrial Revolution in Western Europe seem to have been present in Southeast China at the time, and yet it simply didn't happen. China essentially stagnated, not completely stagnated, but very largely stagnated for 200 years, while Western Europe and the parts of the world associated with Western Europe bounded ahead. Well, I don't think we have a full explanation or understanding of what's going on there. In a sense, the question we need to answer is not why is China growing so rapidly now, but why did China perform so badly for so long? I remember I and one or two colleagues a long time ago once did an exercise when we were asked the question, why is the sherry market in the United Kingdom declining? And we did a bit of work in this, and eventually we realized that the interesting question was not why the market for sherry in the UK was declining, it was why it had ever been so large in the first place. There was this rather peculiar sweet sherry drink, which no Spaniard would be seen putting to his or her lips, which had become popular in Britain, probably as a result of smart advertising way back in the 1930s. My mother, I remember, kept a dusty bottle of sherry, which was for the minister. And when the minister arrived, this bottle of sherry would be undusted, and he'd be poured a small glass of sherry. I realized that to be a minister in the Church of Scotland, you would have had to find some device for coping with these glasses of disgusting sherry as you went round visiting your parishioners. And another glass might be consumed at Christmas. And the explanation of why this market was declining was the customers who formed part of it were dying off. And there weren't any new ones taking their place, and there weren't ever likely to be. So the sherry question has always been in my mind. The sherry problem has always been in my mind as the description of the question, where the right answer to the question is, why are you asking the question rather than to give the answer? But the basic, probably the largest part of the explanation of why it didn't happen in China is that there were deficiencies that prevented China having that right set of social institutions for exploiting all the physical capabilities and the underlying capabilities of the Chinese population, at least until very recently. And of course, there is an open question of how much of that infrastructure China has now successfully put in place. Although part of our problem there is we are tending to regard China as one country. And of course, China is a very large country with many different areas and very different activities. And if you start looking at regions of China, you start to see an economic performance that looks every bit as differentiated across China as does Europe, for example. It's as big a mistake to think of China in this sense as a single unit as it is to think of Europe as a single unit. So that what's happening in China is, as it were, the move of a country towards a technological frontier as it puts together the institutional structure which is needed to reach that. And that means, on the one hand, that Chinese growth can go on for quite a long time because they're quite far from that technological frontier, but eventually, inescapably, it slows down as that catch-up process is actually accomplished. And in parts of the country, they're not so far from having accomplished, that particular process now. But what is it in these sets of institutions that is actually key to enabling that growth to be possible? For me, perhaps the key idea in understanding the dynamics of these successful market economies we're talking about, because one feature we should have emphasized more in identifying that group of rich countries is that all of them are in some loose sense market economies. Now, Norway is very different from the United States and different from Japan and different from Australia. These are all very differentiated countries. But they are all basically market economies, where by market economies I mean that people are very largely free to set up new businesses and to set up and to develop these new businesses in ways they think fit. And that gives rise to what I regard as the basic dynamic of a successful market economy, which is an idea which I describe as disciplined pluralism. It's the idea that on the one hand, you're free to experiment, but on the other, that we have effective processes for monitoring these experiments and for shutting down experiments when they don't work. Now, one way of helping you to think about the idea of disciplined pluralism is, I'll start by telling you the story of Khrushchev's maze. When the Soviet Union started to open up after the death of Stalin in 1953 and Khrushchev's famous secret speech in 3 years later in 1956, Khrushchev went to visit the United States. And when he went to visit the US, he was taken round a supermarket and impressed, as anyone would be, by the breadth and range of goods that were in an American supermarket. But of course, he assumed that, as would have been true in the Soviet Union, that the supermarket had been specially stocked with goods, for the Russian visitors, and the goods would be shipped away again as soon as the Russian party had left, and things got back to normal. But what really impressed him was being taken to Iowa and seeing fields of maize, because the fact was that maize grew from where you were far off into the horizon. There was no way you could fake that. And he went back to Russia thinking that maize was clearly one of the key elements in the prosperity of the US economy. And this actually chimed with Khrushchev's early experience as a young agricultural official, where he'd been engaged in some trials of maize in the Soviet Union. So the answer to the Soviet Union's problems was maize. And he decreed widespread replacement of wheat planting in the Soviet Union. I'm saying the Soviet Union rather carefully because the Ukraine was a large part of this, replacement of wheat by maize. The trouble is there are quite good reasons why people in the Ukraine grow wheat rather than maize. and the experiments didn't go terribly well. But this wasn't what was reported back. What was reported back was the success of the experiments and the enthusiasm with which Soviet farmers greeted the widespread adoption of maize. And in one classic report, which blamed some minor problems on sabotage, it was asserted that under socialism, maize can be grown anywhere. But of course, maize can't be grown anywhere. And indeed, the agricultural setback that followed in the Soviet Union created a wider economic setback and was actually one of the reasons why Khrushchev was actually toppled in 1964. There are two things wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the idea of experimenting with maize in different growing conditions in the very large area of the Soviet Union. What was wrong was trying the experiment on an enormous scale and then not having honest feedback on the progress or on the reality of the failure of the experiment once it manifestly wasn't working. Contrast that with the ways in which what is one of the great successes of the Western economies, the personal computer revolution, happened. The first personal computer, as many of you will know, the first thing we recognize as a personal computer, was built at Xerox PARC, which was the wonderfully innovative lab in California, sponsored by the Xerox Corporation, which produced a whole variety of innovations in the 70s and 80s, basically almost none of which proved to be successful commercial developments for the Xerox Corporation. And people wondered and marveled at their personal computer, but there was never a commercial product that was built out of it. The first reasonably successful personal computer was a kit for hobbyists called the Altair, where you sent away for the bits, and when they were sent to you, you soldered it up yourself. And among the enthusiasts were Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who thought of writing a programming language for this, and that was the origin of Microsoft. And then in the late 70s, other people produced personal computers. I remember the first personal computer I used was made by a company called Sirius, which was a subsidiary of Exxon. Someone in Exxon had clearly decided, rightly but irrelevantly for Exxon, that personal computers were going to be a great new thing. The dog that didn't bark in all of that was IBM, the dominant computer company in the world. And there were all kinds of attempts through the 70s to get personal computers out of IBM, but they all died in the IBM bureaucracy, which understood perfectly correctly that if a personal computer were to be developed, it would destroy their existing business and their positions in it. The IBM personal computer happened because the chief executive of IBM, fed up with all of this, set up a completely off-site operation to establish a personal computer, which is why they bought in an operating system from Microsoft, chips from Intel, and so on, rather than producing these things from the internal resources of IBM. And then IBM swept the market with the PCs, with the personal computer, and exactly what the IBM bureaucrats had predicted would happen did happen, and that destroyed IBM's mainstream business, and the personal computer itself was not a long-run success for IBM, although it was for other people. And so on. And then Apple redefined the market in the early 80s with user-friendly machines, with a brilliant first Jobs idea of the personal computer that you didn't have to know anything about computers to use. It sounds completely obvious, but it was a transformational idea, and it made the whole revolution possible. And yet Apple failed on that. What I want to convey is the idea that this was a chaotic process. It didn't happen because someone had a great vision of how the future was going to evolve, and that was how it developed. It was a shambolic process of endless experiment. Most of these experiments failed, and even a lot of the ones that succeeded technically failed commercially for the companies that developed them. That's actually how a market economy works, and at a subsidiary level, it's also how an effective, innovative process works within a corporation itself. It's disciplined pluralism of being ready to experiment and being ready to get honest feedback on these experiments. Now, I've put together most of the bits of the jigsaw which I'm trying to construct. I'm talking about a world in which the rate at which we all grow, there's a technological frontier that is determined by technological progress and business capabilities, and that's a frontier that's available to everybody. But it's not actually exploited by everybody because large parts of the world, most of the world, in fact, lack the variety of physical and social infrastructure capabilities that are needed to take advantage of it. Countries that put this together can grow very quickly, but in the long run, it's the development of technology and better business that describes how we do. The last part of this story is to ask the question, supposing it is the case, and we think it may well be the case, that quite a large part of the world which has not been successful in developing that kind of social and physical infrastructure over the last 200 years is now developing the capability to do it. Well, the most exciting economic thing that has happened in our lifetime has been that countries in Eastern Europe, China, India have had rather more of the opportunity to move towards this frontier than was true for a very long time in history. How does that affect us in the West? Well, let's be quite clear that these things are not a zero-sum game. When we saw that Kenyan film, they are not poor because we are rich. And while we can do things at the margin, the wonderful things Beverly is doing with her colleagues to help particular bits of development there, it's also very obvious when you think about the implications of that film that in the long run, any success or failure in development in Kenya is going to be achieved by the Kenyans themselves. We can help, but we can help only at the margin. It's an internal process of development that will change that or not, as the case may be. But we're not threatened by that. Far from being threatened as a whole, it is only to our benefit that the rest of the world comes to adopt the technologies and the processes which we know generate the kind of lifestyles that we enjoy. But that doesn't mean it's of unequivocal benefit to all of us. And in particular, what happens is that we see in our countries, as it were, the middle being hollowed out. Think yourself back to the world as it was 5,000, 6,000 years ago, in which people made music frequently for themselves every week around a campfire, in which everyone with a small modicum of musical talent could find a role as being the entertainer for that particular group. Now we have globalization of these activities, and you have Mozart and Beethoven and the Beatles who can make music for the whole of the world. The people who have lost out in that particular one are the rather mediocre musicians who were playing and singing and making tunes for their compatriots before. And that's what's happening here. If we are, either in our personal lives or our corporate lives, as it were, exceptional in the talents we have, then the fact that we can deploy these on a much wider scale is unequivocally to our benefit. And the bigger the market, the better off we will be. What we're doing is, in effect, hollowing out the opportunities for the people who are not quite so good and for the corporations who are not quite so good. And we can see how that's happened as globalization has developed in the world economy, and we can see how it will gather pace if, as we're anticipating, the global market becomes larger and wider than it is. Indeed, we can see how this is already happening, that how companies in the West that have exceptional products and services, whether they be strong brands or strong engineering capabilities, are able to exploit these in a wider and larger market, while companies which have relied more on a protected domestic market find they suffer from the impact of that. That's true, as I say, corporately, and it's true individually as well. So that this move of globalization is one of the causes. I don't actually think it's the principal cause, but it's one of the causes of the widening inequality of distribution within countries that we've seen over the last 2 decades. If one looks at inequality over the global economy as a whole, the growth of India and China has actually narrowed global inequalities, paradoxically at the very same time as it's been widening within country inequalities. And that's a process which is the product of this kind of globalization, and the product, and it's a mechanism which is likely to continue. Can we be sure it will continue? No, of course not. People talk about BRICS and these emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. If we think of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, for each one of these, we have stories of how over the last 200 years, they haven't been able to realize the potential which technology, business processes have given them. In some of these countries, we think that many of these obstacles have been removed. If I go around the 4 one by one, I can see reasons why that might continue. For each of them, I can see reasons particular to their cases as to why they might not. It's easy to see how Chinese politics might go as badly wrong in the future as it mostly has over the last 2 centuries. We've praised rightly the shambolic Indian democracy, which has somehow been consistent with sustained economic growth. But we can see very easily how that can get in the way as people take advantage of that rather naive democracy to stoke up intercommunal tensions. One of the interesting stories we haven't had time to develop is why Argentina dropped out and why Latin America generally so conspicuously underperformed its potential for so long. And in Russia, we can see a lot of things that have gone wrong already. These developments are far from certain. But nevertheless, I'd like to end what I have said this morning on a note of optimism. And the greatest part of that note of optimism are to say that in the last 2 decades, we've raised more people out of poverty than we have in any 2 decades in human history previously. We've narrowed some global inequalities, and we've created for the world as a whole, if not for our own economies, a faster aggregate growth rate than the world has previously experienced. That's taken in all a pretty good record, and there's a good chance it will go on. And I think that's an awful lot more important than what GDP is going to be in the second quarter of 2015.